while you're finishing up, we'll do a little housekeeping. On each table, there's a sign-in list. Will you put a name on there for us, please, so we can get a good count? Thank you. Also on your table is a copy of our litany. It's on there's some large print copies and some half-size copies. If you would find a copy of that litany, we'll read that together.
House reach.
When you're ready, when I'm ready. We gather as Peace Church people, seeking to live and teach as Jesus lived and taught. We proclaim the good news of forgiveness, reconciliation, and peace. We seek to recognize and reject our own violence. We refuse to use violence personally or to justify the use of violence as an instrument of power over others. We strive to learn, to practice, and to teach the skills and discipline of nonviolent action. Through Jesus, we've learned to love those labeled enemies. We pray for them, even when we are called to resist nonviolently their unjust actions. As Jesus in his time stood with victims of oppression and violence, so we stand with today's victims, even in situations of great danger. To realize this vision, we need each other. We seek to be a social expression of justice, hospitality, peace, and compassion. We invite others to share this vision with us and to discover its reality in their congregations and communities. We gather as Peace Church people, trusting that the transforming spirit of love will guide us on our journey. Bill's got some announcements.
Again, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Just a few announcements. First of all, I was on the back table there are some materials that Kathy has brought, Kathy Kelly, and she encourages people to peruse those materials and take what they might be interested in for further understanding of her work and her group. Announcements from around the area here on at Solomon's Porch, which is just up the road here on 46th Street. 2 days from now, Wednesday, 7 p.m., there is an Iran teach-in, What America Needs to Know, and it involves a panel discussion with some academics in the local area who are from Iran, as well as Bill Beeman, a well-known scholar on foreign policy from the University of Minnesota. And there is a ribbon making party, and Karen Leva is going to show an example of what this is. It's involving two different venues for this: spending time together in a supportive environment to start working on your own ribbon panel, and they are going to have sessions for making these 36 by 18 inch ribbons. One is this Thursday at the WHAM office, 4200 Cedar Avenue, and then a week later, Thursday, February 6th, at Spirit of St. Stephen's on 2201 First Avenue. Both are from 10:30 to noon.
The panels will be tied together, and for the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, we will have some sort of presence at the events in St. Paul and Minneapolis. So join us. Thank you.
Yes. On Saturday, February 8th, also at the WHAM offices at 4200 Cedar Avenue in Minneapolis, there'll be a screening of the movie Gaza Fights for Freedom. It's about the March for Freedom, the efforts by the Palestinians try to right of return marches for which they have suffered immeasurably, with over 600 Palestinians being killed, murdered, thousands injured as they try to return to the what are now the occupied territories, or not occupied, but Israel itself. And that is set for Saturday, February 8th at 10 a.m. And as a bonus, the director of this film, Abby Martin, will be brought in by Skype to discuss the movie and its implications after the film has been screened. Also at the WEM offices, 4,200 seater, on February 15th at 9:30 is a what they call a coffee hour, focus on Chile, involving Michael Livingston, a professor at College of St. Benedict, who has actually taught in Chile, will be giving a discussion on what's happening in Chile with the upheaval there. And again, that's 9:30 on Saturday, February 15th at the WEM office, 4,200. This on Saturday the 14th, again at the Cedar at the WEM office, 4,200 seater. This is in the evening. It's a 7 p.m. event. Saturday, February 14th. People's impeachment hearing.
February 14th is a Friday.
Saturday. Oh, they got Saturday the February 14th. Okay. So they have Saturday the 14th twice here on this announcement. Okay. I'm not sure if it's on Saturday the 15th or on Friday the 14th.
What time is it?
They have it at 7 p.m. And this was, I don't believe this was in the WHAM calendar. Anyway, put the real crimes for the Trump administration on trial. They even have trial spelled wrong. Got trail here.
It's a walk.
So check on that further through your own Googling on where, if it's on the 14th, Friday, or on Saturday the 15th.
And what is the it?
The it is the people's impeachment hearing, put the real crimes of the Trump administration on trial. It does look to be at 7 p.m. at 4,200 seater. Okay. And then the Grandmothers for Peace will meet on Wednesday, February 5th, so that's a week from this Wednesday, at the Edina Community Library, Grandview Square, starting at 1 p.m., and we'll have a presentation and discussion of the book On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. So again, hosted by the Grandmothers for Peace, which I believe is based in Edina, at the Edina Community Library, Grand Square Mall, 1 p.m., discussion of the book On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And last is the Peace for the Ages at the Hopkins Center for the Arts, 1111 Main Street, Hopkins. It's called Peace for the Ages with the word, with 4 as the number 4. And I just have here that it's an intergenerational collaboration, 5 performances only between these 3 days, each one being 90 minutes. 28 actors ranging in age from 11 to 87 give a complex and varied perspective on peace. So again, that's at the Hopkins Center for the Performing Arts, 1111 Main Street in Hopkins. 5 performances between over March 27th to the 29th, so that would be Friday through Sunday. And so that should do it for the announcement. Oh, yes.
Hi, I'm Debbie Andreessen, and on Valentine's Day, which is February 14th, whatever day it falls this year.
It's a Friday.
It's a Friday. There'll be at the, from 11 to 2, the Native American, this is Native American led, and it has to do with missing and murdered Indigenous women. They have a yearly rally. It's been growing, and it would be good to go and support them. The missing and murdered indigenous women, there's so many Native American women who, it's an epidemic, and so many women have been raped and trafficked, and it's a serious problem in our community. And also, I'm not going to elaborate, but if you know anything about MN 350 and Enbridge, go to the Public Utility Commission on Friday. It starts at 8:30 in the morning, or you can go earlier. And the Public Utility Commission is going to be re-looking at the environmental impact statement.
And where is that going to be?
It's at the Public Utility Commission in St. Paul. You can just.
It's going to be at the Senate building.
Yeah, it's going to be at the Senate building.
Oh, the Senate office building.
I
Oh,
think it's
okay.
in the Senate office
Senate
building.
piece.
Senate off, oh, okay, I misunderstood. Thank you, Bill. Okay, thank you.
That new building.
And I just got someone went online to check about the confusion on the date and day for the people's impeachment hearing. It is Friday, February 14th, 7 to 9 p.m. at the WHAM office, 4200 Cedar Avenue. So it's Friday the 14th, not Saturday the 14th. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. You should know that the video tonight is being streamed to the WHAM website. So if you want to, Facebook page. And Don's taping it, and we'll probably put it on his show sometime. And we're really very glad to have our friend Kathy Kelly here. She's going to talk to us about our unending presence in the Middle East. Kathy.
Well, good evening. First of all, can everybody hear me back in the back? I still have that high school study teacher's voice. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you. Thank you to WHAM for organizing the talks, for all of you who've come here tonight. It's good to see people as far away as Luck, Wisconsin, who've come down from Anathoth Farm, and very good to see familiar faces and to recognize the ways in which over the years so many of you have caught courage from one another. And I think courage is the ability to control our fears, and we rightly are a bit fearful, I think. What's coming ahead? And so I'd like to think a little bit with you mainly about what I believe we can learn from some of the simplest and most ordinary people. I'm thinking of villagers who really don't have too much of a choice in terms of our forever wars. But I want to start by noting a sad irony. Marie Braun called me and said, well, WHAM would like to invite me to come to various locales in Minnesota, and that was in mid-November. And lo and behold, after we had settled on a talk title that would be Wounds of War, Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, Marie said, oh, Kathy, would it be all right if we add in another war? And that's what it means, as Jack Nelson Pallmeyer has taught us so well, to live in a permanent warfare state. One of my more cynical young friends said, oh, are you sure it's permanent? So, there's also the war against the environment that goes on in our time as well. But I would like to start thinking a little bit about Iran. When I think about economic sanctions, I think that's war. The economic sanctions that were imposed on Iraq were so brutal, they were so lethal, and they just directly affected the people who could do the least about Saddam Hussein. Were you going to expect ever that toddlers and infants and their sorrowing mothers would be able to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein, and that by somehow ratcheting up the pain and suffering, this would cause an overthrow? And Iraqis used to come up to us, even Iraqis working in the government, and say to us, look, if you want to overthrow a government, they certainly weren't going to say you want to overthrow Saddam. If you want to do that, then strengthen social services, strengthen education, strengthen international ties. And the sanctions do exactly the opposite of that. So much so that I think we could say that the United States has now been at war against Iran for the past 18 months. Because the kinds of sanctions that have been imposed have so crippled that economy Now factor in also that on the map, there's a veritable necklace of United States bases surrounding Iran, Afghanistan, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Turkey, and they're hemmed in, and the Iranian military, their entire budget would be used up in 15 days of United States military spending. The government revenues that came from oil receipts constituted 70% of Iran's economy. So on March 8, 2018, when President Trump more or less ripped up the joint comprehensive plan of action and said, well, now the Iranians aren't in compliance because we ripped it up, so we're going to have to put sanctions on them. They basically took their oil exports down from 2.5 million barrels per day to a few 100,000 barrels per day. The economy is crippled. People, ordinary people, are suffering. And, you know, I believe in pacifism, I truly do. But it doesn't surprise me if a government starts to look for what they sometimes, I guess, call asymmetric ways of warfare, when they know that they're not going to be able to have any kind of playing field that's even barely level with the kinds of military weaponry that the United States has and continues to create and to use. And so that then starts to spiral even more so. It's true that the government of Iran likely is supporting fighting groups in other countries in the world. And the Saudis will hit back, and the United States will continue to say, well, they're threatening world security and world peace. But I again want to appeal to the wisdom of Jack Nelson Palmyre, who has made it so clear that the United States simply does not have the capacity to ensure and enable peace and order in our world today. Rather, I think quite the contrary, we've acted in a very reckless and menacing way toward countries all around the world. You know, there was a time in 1946 and beforehand when there was no such thing as the Department of Defense. It was called the War Department, as it should be, because it's such a misleading idea to think that our Pentagon and our weapons corporations and our capacity to export more weapons than the next 8 countries combined is defending the interests of people in the United States or anywhere else in the world. And so I'd like to think with you a bit about some of the places where some very brave and enterprising reporters have helped us to understand better the consequences of war, the wounds of war. And one of the places that's been on my mind very much so is a place I haven't visited in person. It isn't for lack of trying to get a visa to go to the country of Yemen, but the Saudis are not going to let human rights people or anybody who's not official UN get on the plane, the one plane a week that's organized by the World Food Program, to fly into the airport in Sana'a. It's completely blockaded. And by the way, the Saudis that are blockading the ports of Yemen are using ships that will be built in the Marinette shipyard. These littoral combat ships in Marinette, Wisconsin, will be constructed by Lockheed Martin with a multi-billion-dollar contract and then sold directly to the Saudis. And this is what's being used to block off the ports in Yemen. But the Saudis have also been using very, very sophisticated missiles. One system is called the Paveway missile system. Much of it is manufactured by Raytheon in their plant in Tucson, Arizona. And there's a village in Yemen called Arhab. And because of drought, because of the general situation of impoverishment, the villagers weren't doing very well and they weren't able to get water. And of course, this is a source of great alarm. Their livestock will thirst to death and they can't grow plants. And so they did what made so much sense for people to do. They kind of set aside their differences and they formed a cooperative of sorts, and they collected money from all kinds of villagers and got together enough to buy a rig and start drilling. And they drilled, and there's no water. And they kept on drilling, and still no water. And people were beginning to wonder, had they been fooled, had they been conned? And finally, one night, the water came gushing forth. And so the villagers were ecstatic. They were dancing and singing, and people stayed up until late in the night. They probably had cut shoes together, a mild narcotic that Yemenis often chew. And then it was time to sort of get back to their homes, and all of a sudden, a warplane using weapons that came from the United States dropped the equivalent of 200 tons of TNT on those celebrating people. The shrapnel from the bomb that fell traveled at the speed of 1,000 miles per hour. People were decapitated, their bodies were rearranged. There were many people that night killed, but it's in the middle of the night, right? So 6 hours later, as happens in these circumstances, other villagers whose loved ones hadn't returned, who knew something had happened out there in the fields, started to go out to find out what had happened. And sometimes people couldn't restrain the children. You know how curious children can be. And they were speeding out because they wanted to see what's going on. And then the warplanes returned. And they bombed for hours. And there were people diving into the cornfields trying to escape the bombs. And there were young children that had been killed. And this was done through the weaponry supplied by the United States and manufactured in Tucson, Arizona. You can read about it in a very long and a very heart-wrenching article by Jeffrey Stern that appeared in the New York Times Magazine. I want to think with you about a village in Afghanistan, much more recently in 2019 in November, in the village of Nangarhar. It's very close really to Kabul. The next province over going east is called Jalalabad. And there's an area where people were especially poor, and I don't approve of child labor, but you know, people have to feed their families, and so the workers that came to work at harvesting the pine nuts in the forests in this area of Nangarhar had come together, but they were hired by a man who very wisely had written a letter that he sent to the Afghan government. He got copies of the letter to the Taliban. He gave the exact dates when the harvesters would be gathered. He told exactly where they would be. To no avail. The United States came in with a C-130 transport plane, bombed those villagers, and there were 32 people killed, 32 people killed, 40 wounded. And I think about a child who's working in one of those fields, and suppose the child experiences a broken limb. What kind of help does a person get in that circumstance out in the middle of a rural area of Afghanistan? I can guarantee you they're not going to get physical therapy or a prosthesis if needed, or clean bandages, or nursing care, or surgery. That's just not available. And so people suffer through these circumstances of being maimed and wounded and traumatized and bereaved as survivors after loved ones who meant us no harm have been killed. Forgive me because I know some of you have heard this story before, but it weighs on my heart and it simply doesn't go away. I have O negative blood, so they're always glad to see me at the Italian hospital in Kabul called the Emergency Surgical Center for Victims of War. And I was there with my young friends. We had all agreed we'll donate blood. And then I asked Luca Radelli, the person who is the head nurse, or at the time was the head nurse at the hospital, Luca, are there still any patients here from Kunduz? I heard that your hospital took in many of the patients who had been survivors of the bombing of the Kunduz hospital. And he said, oh, Laura, yeah. He told me they had 91 patients who'd gone that 5-hour drive over terrible roads to get to the hospital in Kabul, where there was at least better technology and doctors might be able to save the patients. And he said they were all gone except one, Khalid Ahmed. And he said he is so lonely. Now, you take your friends and you go see. So my young friends sat with Khalid Ahmed. And he told us a very harrowing story. His mother had said to him the night before he went to his job, no, my son, do not go. It's too dangerous. Please stay home. And he said, but Mom, last week We treated 350 patients, and 59 of them were children. And I'm a pharmacist. I have to go. There's not somebody to replace me. And Mom, who's going to bomb a hospital? And so there was a big explosion at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And Khalid Ahmed and the chief pharmacist went running up the stairs, and they saw that the patients they had been treating were burning in their own beds. That machines were falling down on top of patients, that it was primarily, in fact only, the intensive care unit and the emergency room of this large hospital complex that were being bombed. And so the authorities, it was a Médecins Sans Frontières hospital, they quickly called the Afghan government, the United Nations, NATO, the Americans, they said, you're bombing a hospital. Well, this bombing continued with Bofors cannons and Gatling guns, a C-130 transport plane. It went on in 15-minute intervals for an hour and a half. And so the two pharmacists, Khalid and his boss, looked at the security people and said, well, what should we do? And the security people said, you're going to have to run for it. But look, first, take apart your cell phone, because these planes have a capacity to track your cell phone, and even if you're running, they might catch you. So they took apart their cell phones, and then the chief pharmacist made a run for it, and then they said to Khalid, okay, go. And Khalid ran as fast as he could. He got 1 foot outside the gate. He took shrapnel in the back, fell to the ground. He was bleeding profusely, and he managed to roll himself into a ditch. But he realized he was beginning to lose consciousness. And in Afghan tradition, if you can, and you know you are at the end of your life, you try to reach your father and say that you're sorry for anything you might have ever done in your life to hurt him or hurt the family. But you see, Khalid Ahmed had already taken apart his cell phone. So he reached in the back, and he managed to get the battery back in. He managed to reach his home. His mother was, of course, in a panic. He kept saying, I must talk to my father. And he got on the phone with the father, and before he lost consciousness, the father managed to find out from him, my son, where are you? And he said, I'm in the ditch, the first gate. And they had relatives. So the relatives went speeding over. They found a body bag, and they managed to place Khalid's broken body in the body bag. He came to consciousness ever so briefly, and he said, I'm not dead, I'm not dead. And mercifully, they got him to the emergency hospital. When I met him, he was sallow-complected. He had an internal catheter. He could only stand with great difficulty and needed assistance to walk, but he was recuperating. He would be saved. They'd removed the shrapnel from his back. And then you could tell he was, I don't know, with survivor's guilt, but he wanted my young friends to know that 43 people had been killed that day, and 13 of them were colleagues of his, 3 of whom were doctors. And then he looked at me and he asked them, who is she? And as they always say, they said, oh, she's our grandmother. And he said, well, where is she from? And they said, well, she's from the United States. And he didn't miss a beat. Why did your people want to do this to us? He asked. We were only trying to help people. Why did your people want to do this to us? We were only trying to help people. When I first visited the Emergency Surgical Center for Victims in Kabul, I was just amazed to meet a very sturdy young nurse named Filippo. And Filippo would periodically stuff in a big, huge backpack as many medical supplies and medicines as he possibly could fit in it. And then an ambulance, an emergency surgical center ambulance, would take him as far as the road would go, and then he'd get out and he would hike up the mountainside. And there, the villagers would come and meet him, and he'd be able to distribute first aid and medical care at goodwill. And when I had met him, he said that the last time he had gone on that kind of trip, before he was going to take a 6-month leave, villagers had walked 4 hours in the snow to be able to say goodbye to him. And he said to me, I fell in love. He fell in love with the villagers. And that's what could be. You know, what the Emergency Surgical Center for Victims of War spends in a given year is just the tiniest fraction of what the United States has spent on its military, on its very horribly failed reconstruction efforts. There was one point when, this may sound embellished, but it's not, just keeping one U.S. soldier in Afghanistan for 1 year during the time of the surge and then what was called the largest retrograde mission in military history, when the surge people started to return. That cost, because of the way the United States military spends and wastes, it cost $2 million per soldier per year to accomplish all of that movement of the soldiers during and after the surge. $2 million per soldier. So, again, Luca Radelli at the Emergency Surgical Center for Victims of War said to me, Laura, just you tell 3 of your soldiers goodbye. They go home early, huh? And you give me $6 million. What I do with it? I build another hospital. I mean, this is what could be, and instead when we get the Afghanistan papers and John Sopko's very careful reporting on waste and on corruption, we find that the United States was giving money for ghost hospitals. X marked the spot where there wasn't even a building. 6 of the hospitals that supposedly the United States was building were in the middle of the Mediterranean. Several were in Tajikistan, some were in Pakistan. Some, there wasn't a building anywhere with it, but people were collecting the money for it. And that fed so much corruption. So I want to tell one more story, and it's a very, very tragic story about villagers in Afghanistan. In this case, and it goes back to 2008, but I think it's so instructive. You can read about it in USA Today. The village of Azizabad was in a place where there was such high unemployment. People didn't have jobs, they weren't able to make a living off the land. But there was an airport that the United States wanted to expand. And in order to do that, they needed to have protection for the construction workers. Well, I mean, I can understand some of this. It's not like these construction workers who don't have any money are going to have bank accounts and you can write checks and get an individual check to each of the construction workers. It isn't as though they can have direct deposit. So what they would do is get one person who would bring 20 or more workers, and all the money would go to that one person. Well, already, you can see how the corruption develops. So a great deal of money, ostensibly to pay the salaries for all of the workers, is going to one person. So the intelligence operatives from a group called Armor Group, they were later bought out by G4S, they're special security contractors, they hired 2 people. And they called one Mr. Pink and they called the other Mr. White. They hired 2 people to bring together the workers that would be needed to be security for this construction project. Well, there's not only the money for salaries, there were weapons, lots of weapons, and vehicles that would be used in order to accomplish this project. And so eventually, the 2, Mr. Pink and Mr. White, who had been best friends, became best enemies because they began to figure out, we don't really have to have 2 people run this operation. We could have 1 if I eliminate you. Well, this happened. 1 was killed, and there began a cycle of revenge, and it got to the point where the corruption amongst the warlords and people within the town later testified that this was the most vicious and corrupt network in that area of Afghanistan. So eventually they got to the point where they had convinced this group of security operatives that if they could be paid some more money, they would deliver more or less a top Taliban criminal. Well, what they didn't communicate was that the reason for this Taliban commander to be coming to Azizabad was because invitations had been sent out to many, many, many families to come together for a celebration of somebody's life a year after that person had died. It was like a second funeral. And so people had come with their children, with their finest clothing, with many preparations, and after cooking food and really having long hours of conversation into the night. And then, because the United States forces had not bothered to check and find out what the circumstances were or what kind of intelligence they'd really need before they started a massive bombing, every single house was leveled. There were 91 people killed, 60 of whom were children. So when villages experience this kind of thing, this village, they had a riot, they were infuriated, they were so angry at what the United States had done, and so many of them were working for the United States, holding up their IDs, shouting in their agony. Well, the Taliban doesn't have a very terribly difficult time recruiting from that population. And so now when we hear that the Taliban is controlling large sections of Afghanistan, it doesn't surprise me at all. The foolhardiness, the folly, the cruelty of the United States policies, military policies in Afghanistan have certainly warranted the same kind of fury that I think we're now seeing in Iraq. I suppose, you could ask, what part of go home doesn't the United States military understand? That they want us out. It's, to me, especially galling that the United States can say that it's operating in defense of people's interests, that it's saving people, that it's protecting people. There was a time when I was in Amman, Jordan, and 2 teenagers came to visit me, and they begged, please, can you go into Iraq, and can you go to Basra, to a prison that's south of, Basra is the southernmost port city, that's south of there. We were just released from there, and it's a terrible prison, and 5 of our friends are still there. And can you just find out, are they okay? Is there a way to get them out? They haven't been able to get word to anybody, and we couldn't either when we were in this prison. And so it came out that while they were in the prison, and they were young students, they lived in a dormitory on Haifa Street. Saddam Hussein loved to bring students into Baghdad from Gaza, from Palestine, give them very good situations for study, and then he would get the adulation of people in other parts of the Middle East saying, oh, Saddam, he's quite helpful. So these kids, when they knew that the United States was going to quite likely invade and bomb Iraq in the shock and awe bombing, were being told by their parents, get home, come home now, leave Baghdad. And they said, but you don't have a school for us to go to if we go back home. We'll lose all of our study. Let us take a chance and stay here. Well, when the Marines came into Baghdad, they went right to Haifa Street, because that's where the highest building was located, and they systematically started to take over every floor of the student dormitory on Haifa Street, and they quickly checked IDs, and if they saw that somebody had an ID card from a foreign country, that person was immediately tagged as a TCN, a third country national, and sent off to prison. So the 2 who had visited me were sent off to this prison in Basra, which, I've been in some pretty bleak places. I've never seen anything like this place. We were spitting flies out of our mouth. The sand was greasy and black. The sun was blazing. There was no protection from the sun. This is a tent camp. They haven't even constructed buildings yet. The kids told us that they were terrified trying to sleep at night because they knew there were desert scorpions in the sand. Or if it was in the colder weather, those desert sands get very, very cold late at night, and they wouldn't get enough blankets. They were told that they had to beg for their food, and do that by holding up their bowl and either barking like a dog, and dogs are not considered cute pets in the culture they grew up in, or they had to say, "I love George Bush." They were paraded naked in front of United States women military. And this to them was a huge humiliation and a great shame. They knew that some of the prisoners were molesting 13-year-olds who were also in this prison camp. And they were begging the United States prison guards, because these two spoke English, "Please, can you do something? Can you separate these kids? This is wrong." They couldn't get in touch with their families. They knew only that it could be as long as 6 months to a year before they'd even have a chance to go in front of a U.S. military tribunal and possibly be sprung from the place. So they got out, but their 5 friends are still there. Well, God bless the Christian peacemaker teams. They very wisely, after the 2003 shock and awe bombing, made friends with the United States military that were running various prisons. I greatly admire them for having done that. It allowed them to create a database, and they had the name and the capture tag number of many, many prisoners, and they managed to figure out the numbers, the ID numbers, for the ones that I wanted to visit. And a good friend of ours agreed to drive us all the way down to Basra, then across the sands. Mike Miles will know our friend Satar. If you need a friend in a difficult situation, he's your man. Steve Clemens as well. And so we got to this Buka compound, so named because Joe Buka was a firefighter on 9/11, and I guess they had I remember they had a big garish painting of 9/11 and the World Trade Center in flames, and I suppose if the soldiers themselves, the prison guards, were starting to feel despair, maybe they would be kind of coached to think, well, this is worth it because of 9/11 and what was done to the United States. So the brother of one of the prisoners was a dentist from Baghdad, and he did the interpreting, and there was a very, very tender scene when he saw his brother after those many months, and the relief and the embrace we were able to witness. And then he started to ask them what their experiences were, and everything they said directly corroborated what the two had told me in Amman. They couldn't have compared notes or written letters to each other. The reason I wanted to tell you that whole story is because Ali Baghdadi, the person who founded ISIS, was imprisoned for part of the time of his detention in Abu Ghraib, and for the other part of his time in the Buka compound. So when the United States tries to tell us that we have to be in Iraq to protect people from ISIS, I think we have to ask the government and ask the military, what do you think got ISIS started in the first place? Might it not have a great deal to do with the imposition of economic sanctions on Iraq that brutally and lethally caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of children? Those children had brothers and uncles and fathers. Might it not have something to do with the shock and awe bombing? I was in emergency rooms in the Baghdad hospital day after day and saw children's bodies torn apart, children with their arms ripped off, children who asked the doctors, will I always be this way? And so our question, my friends, will we always be this way? And it hurts to ask this question, doesn't it? Will we always be this way? And yet, we at least have the choice to ask the question. We have the guidance of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who told us we're a society gone mad on war. We have the wisdom of little Greta Thunberg hollering at us as she must do. And, you know, we have that possibility, every church a peace church, to do what you've done so beautifully here. Gather on the bridge, gather out in front of a lion tech, gather in the courts, catch courage from one another, pass on to the next generation that determination that we can come to our senses, we can and we will. We don't always have to be this way. And so as we come to our senses together and begin the sense-making of saying, we don't want to give another dime to the warlords in this country. Do you know the CEOs of the top major corporations profited to the tune of $7 million just in the suggestion that the United States might go to war with Iran. They're paid in stocks, and those stocks went up. And the guy that owns General Atomics, which manufactured the drone that killed General Qasem Soleimani, he's now worth $4.1 billion. Now, I know no person's worth is calculable in terms of dollars and cents. Of course, that's not the case. But we are responsible for what we turn over to this government. And of course, we know that there is a better way. We can give our money to groups that we know personally, groups that we know will take that money and use it for good things, who won't turn it into wasteful and cruel means of obliterating and destroying people. And so we go forward. I want to close with the words that Barbara Deming gave a long time ago. I find it so hopeful, maybe especially in this winter season. Locked in winter, summer lies. Gather our bones together, rise. Thank you very much.
We're going to give Kathy a few minutes to break, and she's offered to take, excuse me, to respond to your questions. And while we do that, we're going to pass around a couple of hats, and so be generous, and we can give some money to her organization to continue this work.
Announce what you put on your check.
Oh, thank you. Caesar, if you'd like to make out a check, you could make it out to Voices for Creative Nonviolence, or just VCNV.
DCNV. Okay. Questions? We'll go for it. I got it.
So questions, comments, ideas, criticisms? Thank you.
Kathy, I admire your courage, your determination, your stamina. I've listened to you many, many times. God bless you. That's all I can say there. And I just lost my train of thought. But are you aware of the Tappy pipeline going through Afghanistan? And do you know of the status of that? And before you answer that question, I have another statement I want to make, but keep your mind on the Tappy pipeline. Does anybody know about the Tappy pipeline? Tappy, T-A-P-I? No. This was a pipeline proposed back in the mid-90s. Elements of the Taliban actually met in Texas, of all places, to talk to an oil company. I don't wish you would finish that one. But look at this rule. Look at the hair, the gray hair. We were the people protesting Vietnam when there was a draft on. We were the people protesting when our fathers might have been saying, yay, yay, rah, rah, war, we're going to kick the commies. But it was the kids. I'm proposing, if you really want to stop the war business, let's have a war tax of maybe 10%, and let's get the draft back. Get that draft back, have a war tax, draft young women and men. I think that will help stop this. Now you can talk about the Tappy pipeline.
Thank you. You know, I sometimes think, yeah, get a draft, but start with 40 and up. And then, you know, spare a thought for my young friends in Afghanistan. They do not want to join anybody's military, but with 41% unemployment, you know, there aren't other jobs available for them, and they scramble. I mean, they're trying to learn trades and help the street kids learn trades, but it's not easy. I will talk about TAPI, but I think I have something that's a little bit hopeful that I can say about, well, militarism. You know, the United States Postal Service puts out reports constantly that the census also, that tell exactly how many weapons the United States sells in a given year and to whom. So in 2019, my Irish temper was flaring because it said that the United States was selling $23 million worth of bullets to Afghanistan. And I thought, you know, here's a country poised at civil war. Who would ever sell them $23 million worth of bullets so they can shoot at each other? Is that what's going on? But I think I understand something a bit differently now. Apparently in 2018 and 2017, many people in the employ of the Afghan Defense Forces and the Afghan local police and the Afghan National Security Forces were taking the bullets that were given to them, going out in the middle of the night, and boom, 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 shooting them out into the air, and then collecting the casings from those bullets and taking them to the local scrap metal dealer and cashing them in and putting food on the table. Now, I think that's great, you know. I think they weren't killing Taliban. They were doing something much better with those bullets, and now some person in the United States decided, well, then we need to replace all those bullets, I think, instead of the $23 million worth of bullets. But the Turkmenistan, Afghan, Pakistan, India pipeline was the brainchild of Unocal. And it looked as though they would be able to start a pipeline up in the Stans, Turkmenistan particularly, and then extend that pipeline so that it would go all the way through Pakistan and into India. Now, they could not get to first base with that project. Every time they tried to extend it, you know, it just reminds me of Lawrence of Arabia. Somebody would blow something up, or there would be some kind of a stoppage in the program. But I do think that that TAPI pipeline is suggestive of part of the reason the United States wants so badly to keep its bases in Afghanistan. I think there is a desire to make sure that China and Russia don't make headway in any kind of material gain in Afghanistan, although even China has, you know, started to say, yeah, we're going to develop a big copper field at Mezainak, and then it doesn't go anyplace. But also I think the United States wants to be able to say, with its guns aimed in every direction, we've got these bases. 3 of those bases are right on the border, butting up against Iran. So I don't think the United States is going to want to leave Afghanistan, but it seems like they've missed their moment to try to gain from Afghanistan's potential mineral wealth. From what I'm hearing, the rare earth metals that might well have been in the ground in Afghanistan are no longer the ones that are so valuable, and it would take too much to get them out of the ground. And so it doesn't look as though President Trump's recent suggestion that there's, you know, trillions of dollars of profit in Afghanistan is going to be borne out. Does that connect with what you were thinking about the TAPI pipeline?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
So a couple of days ago, they commemorated the 75th anniversary of the Holocaust. And there's never any acknowledgement. There's a continuum. You know, what is the moral difference between what our government does and what was done 75 years ago? It's, to me, I mean, there's so much sanctimonious declarations of how that's all past us.
I have friends that are part of the Kings Bay Plowshares 7, and their major banner speaks of omnicide. You know, one of them, a Jesuit priest, has been in the Glynn County Jail in Brunswick, Georgia, since April 3rd. That's a very long, of 2018. That's a very long time to spend in one of these miserable county jails. we're not related to each other, but he writes me on these little tiny postcards. All he's allowed to use are little tiny postcards, and he fills it in with kind of cramped script, and he calls me Kathy of Kellydom. I think he really sees the world, very much apart from governances. But, I think of, the willingness on his part and others to risk their lives and radically change their lives in order to speak out against the repetition again and again and again of genocide. And it is what's required. It's very, very challenging to me.
I just want to make some comments to support what you've done so dramatically and so wonderful. I'm Tom White, and I can't help but not say something about what we spend on the military, and what Kathy talks about and the sentiment with which she does it brought to mind when I started out putting those cards out, and I'm talking on behalf of WHAM, because I just redesigned a card that they will print in the next 10 days, like this one that just finished 2019. And they're going to print 15,000 in the next 2 weeks. Kristen Dooley over there is doing it, and I'm talking on her behalf because I get more and more cynical, and as someone like you talks, I get more and more serious about we've got to stand up in the streets. And as Kathy said, it will get worse. When I started putting out the card, I remember going around saying, we have in the United States 700 bases in 131 countries of the world to support our corporations, and can't keep a little kid from being shot off a bike in North Minneapolis. Yeah. And it is sick. It is so sick. Yes. Oh, but I just got to make some comments on the new card, because I keep getting a little more cynical, and it's so true that we will spend this here. We have in the card, and I've got the layout here. And when you get them, this is the layout, and they'll print them, and it's front and back. We are spending this year $738 billion on our military, and we're only including 2/3 of what they're actually spending, which has been moved over to other budgets. And the case is made in the card that the cost of our military right now is over $1 trillion. We spend, that's on the board, $738 billion. Know how much Iraq, who is one of our, or Iran, who is one of our enemies, spends? 1/100th, and we're supposed to be scared to death. Russia is second at 144. We're 738 billion, and actually $1 trillion when you put all the numbers together, but you'll see that on the card. But our whole budget, this is the most current update put out by National Priorities Project and CIA World. Trump's shameful 2020 budget proposal, which you'll never see until it's effected, cuts $1.5 trillion to Medicaid over the next 10 years, $845 billion to Medicare over the next 10 years, $220 billion cut to food stamps over 10 years, $25 billion to Social Security benefits, $21 billion cuts already on the books to cut assistance to needy families, and $207 billion cuts to wealth. All the money that is saved in that, the billions of dollars, are going to be transferred. All the above cuts, as it says on the card, will be transferred to military spending or tax breaks for the rich. And right now in the U.S., 1%, the top 1% of the people own more wealth than the bottom 90%. And the top of the card says it all. 2020 USA military budget is now 35% of the military spending in the whole world. We are a military government. Just follow the damn money.
Sir, I just want you to know that I've been carrying this card around for years. I wondered if on your card you had rules for this little section called welfare is okay if it's corporate. Because every time somebody wants to engage with me about those placing people who need food stamps, I pull out my card and say, did you know we spend $4,000 a year on corporate welfare for every $26 we spend on nutrition assistance?
That's exactly true, and I'm
This
glad.
has been, I mean, when I'm door knocking and talking to voters, I pull this out all the time.
Well, I remember talking in Minnetonka and some, I don't know, rich guy stood up and said, where the hell do you get your figures? How can you do this? I called him when I got home. I said, give me your phone number. I called him. I gave him all 8 sources that are top down and bottom. And I said, I'd love the favor from you. I've gone to the trouble of getting this. Would you please call me and let me know where I'm wrong? Never got a call. Yeah. I think I followed up 2 or 3 times with him and said, did you find some different, but here is what, and I'll be now 1 minute. The military spending right now, and this is according to the, this is well-sourced on the bottom of each card. Military spending on the U.S. is now 17% of the gross domestic product. Comparatively, Canada, 1%. Russia, 4%. 2% for the United Kingdom. And we're 8 times worse on what we spend on, as a percentage of our gross domestic product. It is so sick that they won't let you know. And as I say, they've scraped the whole thing off now, and 1/3 of the military budget, what used to be in the military budget, isn't even reported. And the facts will prove there is no documentation of any of the facets of the military. I have to go to about 12 sources. That's why I do it, to get the actual numbers. And they say that there's no way that you can document, here the card says, there's no way you can document the amount, the 738 billion, because they can only account for 306 billion of it, which is less than a half. And there are no places that are published where you can find out where the money went. It is just so sick that we'll let it happen. So, God bless you, my dear. But you'll get them, and all you have to do is call Kristen Dooley at Wham, and she'll get them. And I think they charge $5 for 100 or something, and they're only getting their money back. But it's the best thing you can spend. Is just that I really commend you for bringing that up, because carry a card with you, and when somebody gives you the bullshit that we don't spend enough on the military or whatever, give them the card and tell them to call me, because this one, my card, my phone number's on it, and so is Wham. Thanks a lot, Bill, for your time. We were very active members of this group. And in the last 15 years, we're getting old, but I couldn't help but reintroducing myself to a lot of you. So,
Questions for Kathy?
Well, you know, the next stop for me is going to be Mankato, Minnesota, where I'll get a chance to be with Sister Gladys Schmitz and her friend, Sister Alice. And I think about those women, you know, anytime I'm invited to go into, we used to call them mother houses when I was a kid, but to one of the sisters' centers, I always get a lump in my throat. You know, and a frail hand will reach out. But I think of those women who, you know, dedicated their lives, Alice is in her 90s now, to living simply, sharing resources, and trying to be of service to others. And in my experience, they never showed the slightest interest in acquiring personal wealth. So to whom would we entrust our security? Communities like that, and there are so many other communities across the United States that uphold those values, or the military that posture as people that would defend and protect. And you know, what Tom has shown is that they are what Martin Luther King called the demonic suction tube. So to be able to be even a small cog that interferes with that machine is a blessing, and it's especially good to be able to link arms and feel that solidarity with all of you together. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for coming. We'll see you in March, right?